What if I told you that the blueprint for the Holocaust wasn't written in 1930s Germany, but decades earlier, under the brutal African sun? That concentration camps, racially based medical experiments, and an official order to exterminate an entire people were all tested first? On people that history has almost completely erased. This is not a story you learned in school. This is the story of the torn-out Chapter 1 of one of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century. Our story begins not in Europe, but in a place the Romans called Hic sunt Draconis. Here belongs the dragon, the land we now call Namibia. Late 19th century. The world is a chessboard, and the European powers are moving their pieces in a frantic game called the Scramble for Africa. Britain has the empire where the sun never sets. France has its vast territories in the west. Belgium has the Congo full of rubber and blood. And then there is Germany. The German Empire was like an emerging industrial giant, muscular but insecure. It was a latecomer to the imperial game. It had unified late, industrialized quickly, and now it craved what every real power had: colonies. A place in the sun, as it called it. It wasn't just about resources. It was about prestige. It was about showing that Germany was a global player. And it had its eyes set on a barren, sparsely populated patch of land in southwest Africa. They call it Deutsch Südwestafrika, German Southwest Africa. But this land is not empty. It is home to many ethnic groups, the most prominent of which are the Herero people. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, you have to understand who the Herero are. Don't think of them as victims. Think of them as the Texan cattlemen of Africa. They are a semi-nomadic society, with their culture, their wealth, and their entire worldview revolving around one thing: cattle. Cattle are more than just money. They are a living link to the ancestors. They are dowries, a measure of status, the center of religious rituals. Each Herero man has a favorite bull, a father's cow, and when he dies, that bull is sacrificed so that their spirits can accompany him. Their society is intricately organized into two parallel lineages: the maternal, which determines property, and the paternal, which determines religious matters. They're a proud, intelligent, and adaptable people. They had lived on this land for centuries. And then strangers came. First came the missionaries, carrying Bibles and promises. Then came the merchants, carrying wine, guns, and European goods. And finally the soldiers, carrying flags and papers they called protection treaties. Herero leaders, like Maharero Chamuaha, were persuaded to sign these documents. The Germans said they would protect the Herero from rival tribes. But in the language of the empire, protection always meant control. These treaties, written in a language the leaders did not understand, essentially made them tenants on their own ancestral lands. It was an elaborate scam perpetrated on a national scale. And when German settlers began to land, the illusion of a partnership quickly evaporated. Each new ranch, each new fence, is a stab at the Herero way of life. Land is taken. The best watering holes are controlled. Herero herders are suddenly seen as trespassers on land they have walked freely on for generations. Tensions simmer like an infected wound. And then, in 1897, nature struck a devastating blow. It was rinderpest, a cattle plague that swept across Africa. For the Herero, it was more than an economic disaster. It was an apocalyptic event. Up to 90% of their livestock died. Imagine Wall Street collapsing, all the banks failing, and all the churches being razed to the ground, all at once. That's what the Herero experienced. The foundations of their society were shaken to their core, and the vultures began to gather. German merchants and moneylenders saw an opportunity. They offered credits, loans at exorbitant interest rates. "We'll help you rebuild your herd," they said. "Just sign here." The Herero, in desperation, signed. When they couldn't repay their debts, which was nearly impossible, the moneylenders took the last thing they had left, their land. It was a massive transfer of wealth, a conquest by pen and paper, backed by the implicit threat of force. The colonial governor, Theodore Leutwein, coldly admitted, "The Herero had to be forced to work for us. After losing their land and cattle, they had no choice." But oppression doesn't stop at economics. It happens every day in every interaction. The legal system was a farce. The testimony of 7 Africans was worth as much as that of one white man. A German who killed a Herero might receive a small fine, if he was punished at all, but a Herero accused of stealing a sheep might be severely beaten or hanged. Herero women were routinely sexually assaulted. Every humiliation, every brutality, every injustice that went unpunished added fuel to the smoldering fires of anger. They lost their livestock, they are losing their land, and now they are losing their dignity. At the center of this storm was Samuel Maharero. He had tried to cooperate, he had tried to negotiate. He had believed in the German promises, but now he saw his people facing cultural extinction, reduced to landless servants to their new rulers. He received desperate letters from the junior chiefs. "We are dying," they wrote. "We would rather die fighting." Maharero was forced into an impossible choice: continue on the path of submission and watch his people fall apart, or rise up and fight, risking everything to regain what was lost. By the end of 1903, he had made his decision. He sent secret messages to other Herero leaders. The plan was laid. They would rise up en masse. Their objectives were specific: attack German plantations, destroy the railways, and drive out the German army. But Maharero gave a clear directive: spare the lives of the missionaries, the women, and the children. This was not a blind massacre. It was a war of independence. January 1904. The powder keg is full. The tinder is lit. The die has been cast. The first shots of one of history's most forgotten and brutal conflicts have been fired. But no one, including the Herero themselves, could have imagined the reaction that was about to ensue. They planned for a war. What they were about to face was destruction. The first shots of the Herero uprising in January 1904 sent shockwaves through the colony. Samuel Maharero's plan was executed with astonishing precision. The Herero warriors, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, attacked German farms, trading posts and railway lines across a wide front. They were successful. The small German garrison was overwhelmed, and isolated settlers fled in panic to the larger towns of Windhoek and Swakopmund. But here is a crucial point. In the chaos and violence that preceded it, the Herero uprising showed remarkable restraint. At Maharero's behest, the German missionaries were largely untouched, and most importantly, German women and children were generally spared. Despite some tragic exceptions, the original intention was not a racial massacre, but a deliberate attack on the German apparatus of oppression, the soldiers, officials, and settlers who had taken their land. The Herero were not fighting to exterminate the Germans. They were fighting to expel them. They wanted their homeland back. In Berlin, however, those nuances had all but disappeared. The news that was being telegraphed was a tale of savagery, of savage natives slaughtering civilized Germans. The German public, fed a steady diet of nationalism and racial superiority, roared with anger. The press demanded revenge. Politicians demanded a show of force. The humiliation of a European power being challenged by an African tribe was unbearable. Kaiser Wilhelm II took this as a personal affront. His young empire had been humiliated. There could be no negotiation. There could be no concessions. Only total submission. He declared, "Anyone who dares to defy the German flag and harm German honor will pay the price." And to carry out that punishment, he chose a man whose reputation preceded him, a man considered the empire's expert in quelling native uprisings with the utmost brutality. His name was General Lothar von Trotha. If you wanted to create the perfect villain for a story about imperial brutality, you would create Lothar von Trotha. He was the living embodiment of the philosophy of Schrecklichkeit, terror. He believed that the only way to rule inferior races was through absolute fear. He forged this philosophy in blood and fire all over the world. In East Africa, he suppressed uprisings by burning villages and destroying crops. In China, as part of the German expeditionary force that put down the Boxer Rebellion, he earned a reputation for ruthlessness. Trotha himself once said, and this is a direct quote, I wipe out the rebellious tribes with rivers of blood and rivers of money. Only then can something arise. He was not a soldier sent to win a war. He was an executioner sent to carry out a death sentence. When Trotha arrived in southwest Africa in June 1904, he brought reinforcements and a complete disdain for any previous attempts at negotiation. Governor Ludwine, who had tried, however clumsily, to maintain some kind of peace, was sidelined. Trotha assumed full military command, and he had a single goal: to find and completely destroy the Herero fighting force. Within months, Trotha's forces had pinned the Herero down. Samuel Maherero, realizing he was facing a technologically superior enemy, rallied his people. He didn't just rally his warriors. He gathered the entire Herero nation, some 50,000 to 60,000 men, women, and children, along with their precious remaining herds of livestock. They moved to the one place they believed they could stand, the Waterberg Plateau. The Waterberg was a natural fortress, a sandstone plateau towering over the surrounding plains, with their springs and grasslands. For the Herero, it was a strategic hideout. But for Lothar von Trotha, it was the perfect trap. He looked at the map and saw, not a battle, but an opportunity to end the Herero problem once and for all. His plan was ruthless and terrifyingly brilliant. He would not attack head-on. Instead, he would move his army to encircle the plateau from 3 sides, west, south, and east. He would slowly tighten the siege, using artillery and machine guns to terrorize and pin down the Herero. But he would deliberately leave one side open, the southeast. The only way out. That exit leads straight into the Omahiki Desert. To the Herero, Omahiki is a synonym for death. The Germans called it Sandveld, the land of sand. It was a vast, arid, almost waterless wasteland that stretched hundreds of miles into British-controlled Bechuanaland. Trotha wasn't just trying to defeat an army. He was trying to herd an entire civilization into a natural slaughterhouse. On August 11, 1904, the Battle of the Waterberg began. The Germans attacked, their firepower overwhelming. The Herero fought bravely, desperately. The warriors tried to hold their line to protect their families behind them, but under relentless artillery fire and coordinated attacks, their lines collapsed. Panic prevailed. The only way to escape the gunfire was to flee to the southeast. Tens of thousands, in a chaotic mass of people, cattle, and carts, rushed into the trap that Trotha had laid. They were escaping the battle. They were running straight into destruction. As the terrible exodus into the desert began, Trotha closed the trap. He established a 200-mile military cordon along the edge of the desert, ordering his soldiers to shoot anyone who tried to turn back. And then, to ensure that there was no doubt about his intentions, on October 2, 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued an official proclamation. A document that would go down in the annals of human cruelty. It was called the Vernichtungsbefehl, the Extermination Order. It reads,
I, the great general of the German army, send this letter to the Herero people. The Herero are no longer German subjects. All Herero must leave this land. Any Herero found within the German borders, with or without guns, with or without livestock, will be shot. I will not accept any more women or children. Send them back to their tribes or shoot them. These are my last words to the Herero nation, the great general of the mighty German army.
Stop and think about it. This was not a military order issued in the heat of battle. It was a carefully calculated policy statement, issued after the main Herero fighting force had been defeated. It criminalized human existence. It declared that being a Herero, within German-declared borders, was a crime punishable by death. It made no distinction between combatants and infants. It was a state-sanctioned license to commit genocide. To enforce this order, German patrols scoured the desert fringes. They poisoned the few water holes they found. They shot down desperate groups of survivors trying to find their way back. Inside the desert, an unspeakable nightmare unfolded. Tens of thousands of people slowly died of thirst. The stories told by those who survived were horrifying. Desperate mothers killing their children and then themselves to escape the pain. People drinking the blood of their dying livestock. People digging into the damp sand just to cool their chapped lips. The Owyheke Desert had become a giant mass grave. The military battle was over. The policy of genocide was now in full force. The desert was an effective instrument of killing, but it was chaotic and uncontrollable. And for the German colonial administration, efficiency was paramount. A new solution was needed, a more organized, more systematic way to manage death and exploit the dying. They would give it a name that would echo with ominous meaning decades later: Konzentrationslager. Concentration camp. To modern ears, the word carries a terrible weight, conjuring up images of barbed wire, gaunt figures in striped uniforms, and the never-ending chimneys of Auschwitz. But in 1905, in German Southwest Africa, the word was being defined for the first time, not by gas, but by labor, hunger, and despair. General von Trotha's desert genocide, brutally effective as it was, had one major flaw from the German bureaucracy's perspective. It was wasteful. The empire needed to build railways, ports, and cities. German companies needed to mine diamonds and copper. And to do all that, they needed labor, cheap labor, or rather slave labor. The Herero and Nama people dying in the desert were a waste of potential human resources. So policy changed. Trotha's public call for extermination was withdrawn, not because of some moral awakening in Berlin, but because of cold economic considerations. Instead, a new promise was made. Any Herero who surrendered would be spared. They would be given food and shelter. Thousands of people, skeletal ghosts, staggered out of the Owyheke Desert, believing that promise. They were the most tenacious survivors, people who had watched their families die of thirst. They clung to the faintest hope of survival, but they did not walk into the arms of mercy. They walked straight into a system designed to squeeze the last drop of life out of them. Concentration camps were set up all over the colony. Windhoek, Swakopmund, Karibib, but none could match the horror of the site designated for maximum destruction, a place known simply as Shark Island. Shark Island, off the coast of the coastal town of Luderitz, is not really an island at all, but a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of sand. But it might as well be another world. It is a barren rock, whipped by icy Atlantic winds. There is nowhere to hide. A cold fog covers the island almost every day, seeping into the ragged clothes and bones of the prisoners. Thousands of Herero and the Nama people were crammed onto the island. Their homes were makeshift huts made of canvas and scrap wood, inadequate to withstand the bitter cold. Their rations were a recipe for slow death, handfuls of uncooked rice or flour, sometimes with a little rotten horse meat. Diseases such as scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid spread like wildfire. And then there was the labor. Every day, men, women, and even children strong enough to walk were forced to work. They built docks and railways for their captors, labored in icy seawater, and carried heavy rocks until they collapsed. The punishment for working too slowly or collapsing was brutal beatings, often resulting in death. One German officer described it bluntly: a death sentence for all who were sent there. The death rate on Shark Island was staggering, estimated to be as high as 80%. It was not a labor camp. It was a death factory, a murder facility disguised as colonial progress. But the horrors of Shark Island were not limited to physical brutality. It was here that genocide took a decisive step into the darkness, turning racial hatred into a science. Enter the world of Dr. Eugen Fischer. An aspiring anthropologist and geneticist, Fischer came to Southwest Africa not as a soldier but as a scientist. For him, the human suffering in the concentration camps was not a tragedy. It was a unique research opportunity. Fischer was obsessed with the idea of racial purity. He was particularly interested in the children of mixed couples, that is, the children of Herero women and German men. He wanted to scientifically prove that these children were genetically inferior to their German parents. In the camps, he conducted tests on these prisoners, measuring their skulls, recording their physical characteristics, and performing medical experiments. Fischer's work reached its most brutal point in the collection of human specimens. Under orders from the German military, camp commanders were instructed to collect and preserve the heads of dead prisoners. The most gruesome task was assigned to the prisoners themselves. Herero women were forced to remove the heads of their dead husbands, brothers, and children, boil them to remove the flesh, and then use broken glass to scrape off every last piece of skull. The skulls were then packaged and sent to German universities and museums for scientific study. We know this not only from German records, but also from surviving photographs. Shocking images of German soldiers packing these skulls for transport. And here is the direct, undeniable link that lies at the heart of this story. Eugen Fischer's scientific work in Namibia became the basis for his influential book, Principles of Human Heredity and Racial Hygiene. This book became one of the founding works of German eugenics. It argued that the Aryan race was superior, and that racial mixing would lead to the degeneration of civilization. Adolf Hitler read Fischer's book while in Landsberg prison. He quoted its ideas in Mein Kampf. When the Nazis came to power, Eugen Fischer was not ostracized. He was celebrated. He was appointed rector of the University of Berlin and tasked with training SS doctors in racial hygiene. The ideas honed on the skulls of the victims on Shark Island became state policy, leading directly to the Nuremberg Laws, the T4 euthanasia program, and finally, the final solution. The road from the desolate shores of Namibia to the gates of Auschwitz was a straight one, paved with pseudoscience and inhumanity. While the Herero were being destroyed, another tragedy was unfolding in parallel. The Nama, another people to the south, had initially stayed out of the conflict. But as they witnessed the fate of the Herero, they knew they were next. Led by talented guerrilla commanders such as Hendrik Witbooi and Jacob Marenga, the Nama launched their own rebellion. They waged a clever and persistent guerrilla war, inflicting heavy losses on the Germans over 3 years, but they were no match for the industrial might of an empire. One by one, their leaders were killed or captured, and the Nama suffered the same fate. They were herded into the same concentration camps, dying of starvation and disease alongside the remaining Herero. It is estimated that as much as 50% of the Nama population was wiped out. By 1908, the war was over. The genocide was essentially complete. The colony had been pacified. Of the estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Herero people who had pre-war numbers, only about 15,000 remained. A people that had been all but destroyed. The concentration camps were eventually closed, not out of compassion, but because their work was done. The survivors were turned into landless laborers, their property confiscated, their society broken down. The land that had been theirs was now open to German settlers. The German colony was quiet, but in the laboratories and universities back home, the skulls from Shark Island were beginning to tell a new, twisted story. A story the world would not be able to ignore when it was retold, decades later, in Polish. The year is 1915. The guns of World War I echo across Europe, and its effects reach even the farthest corners of Africa. South African troops, fighting under the flag of the British Empire, invade and quickly occupy German Southwest Africa. Germany's colonial reign, which had lasted only 3 decades but was bloody, was over. For the surviving Herero and Nama, was it liberation? No. It was simply a changing of the guard. Their land was not returned. Their autonomy was not restored. Instead, they simply traded one European ruler for another. The land was placed under South African administration, and soon a new, equally methodical and ruthless system of oppression was imposed: apartheid. Their stories, their suffering, were buried under a new layer of injustice. And the world, meanwhile, has forgotten. How could the world forget the first genocide of a century? How could a crime of such magnitude, documented in the documents of its perpetrators, disappear from the history books? The answer lies in the larger tragedies that followed. The flames of World War I burned a generation of Europeans and reshaped the map of the world. Then, just 2 decades later, the nightmare of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust unfolded on an industrial scale, a horror so vast it eclipsed almost every atrocity that had come before. What happened in a remote corner of Africa seemed like a footnote, a tragic prelude to an opera of death that would follow. But for the descendants of the survivors, it is not a footnote. It is their lived reality. Memories are passed down through the generations not in textbooks, but in stories told around the fire, in sad songs, and in the pain of inherited loss. They live on barren lands, while the fertile farms that once belonged to their ancestors are now owned by German families. They are disinherited in their own homeland. For much of the 20th century, their struggle was a whisper in the storm. But they never stopped telling their story. They fought to keep their memory alive against the silence of the world. And then, slowly, the world began to listen. In 1985, a United Nations report, known as the Whitaker Report, officially classified the Herero and Nama massacres as genocide for the first time. It was the first crack in the wall of silence. When Namibia finally gained independence from South Africa in 1990, Herero and Nama activists had a new platform to demand justice. They started targeting a unified Germany. They demanded three things: admittance, apology, and reparations. Germany's response over the decades has been a complex dance of evasion. German politicians will express deep regret for the atrocities of their colonial past, but they have carefully avoided one word: genocide. Why? Because in international law, the word genocide comes with consequences. It opens the door to legal claims for reparations. Germany, which has paid billions of dollars in reparations to Holocaust victims, fears setting a dangerous precedent. If it pays reparations to Namibia, will other former colonies of European nations demand the same? The Pandora's box of colonial justice is one that no European power wants to open. But the pressure continued to mount. Historians uncovered more evidence. Descendant groups held protests in both Namibia and Germany. One of the most symbolic and powerful actions was to demand the return of the skulls stolen more than a century ago. In 2011, in an emotional ceremony at Berlin's Charité Hospital, a German delegation formally returned the first 20 skulls to a Namibian delegation. It was a historic moment. For the first time, the human legacy of this crime had been returned to its homeland. But even then, the German government refused to issue a formal apology. It took another decade, with tense and sometimes bitter negotiations, for the wall to actually come down. In May 2021, after years of negotiations, the German government finally announced that it officially recognized the Herero and Nama massacres as genocide. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas stated, "With a view to Germany's historical and moral responsibility, we will ask forgiveness from Namibia and the descendants of the victims." Along with the apology, Germany pledged a €1.1 billion financial fund to be paid out over 30 years for reconstruction and development projects in Namibia, particularly in the Herero and Nama communities. Is that justice? For many, the answer was a resounding no. The German government was adamant that this was a reconciliation and reconstruction fund, not reparations. Major descendant groups who had led the fight for decades were excluded from the final stages of negotiations, which were conducted between the German and Namibian governments. They felt betrayed. They saw the deal as a way for Germany to buy forgiveness on the cheap and close the history books without truly addressing the wounds. The dispute continues to this day. Justice, it turns out, is much more complicated than a check and an apology. And that brings us back to where we started. Why is this story, the story of a nearly forgotten genocide in a faraway land, so important? It is important because it is not an isolated event. It is a link in a terrible chain of events. Ideas about habitat living space for the Germans did not begin with the invasion of Poland. It began with the seizure of the Herero pastures. The idea of racial purity and the dangers of race mixing was not invented by Nazi theorists. It was scientifically proven by Eugen Fischer on captive children in Namibia. The methodology of herding a people into camps, numbering them, starving them, and working them to death did not begin at Dachau. It was practiced on Shark Island. The complete dehumanization of a group of people to justify their systematic killing, turning them into animals or subhuman creatures in official documents, was perfected by General von Trotha before it was repeated by Heinrich Himmler. What happened in Namibia was more than a prelude, it was a dress rehearsal. An experiment in which the tools and ideologies of industrial destruction were honed and tested. It demonstrated that a modern, civilized European state could, with the aid of science, bureaucracy, and the military, carry out the total annihilation of a people. The lesson was learned, and the world paid a terrible price for not paying attention. The story of the Herero and Nama is a tragic reminder that genocide does not spring from a vacuum. It grows from smaller ideas, from arrogance, from greed, from normalized racism. It is a warning about how easily we forget inconvenient histories and why it is so important to fight for memory. Because in the darkness of forgetting, the seeds of similar crimes are always waiting to be planted again.